Welcome to Anews. I'm Amir Taslim and you're watching Turkish Diplomacy. As Gaza's death toll surpasses 60,000 and starvation deepens, France has become the first G7 nation to recognize Palestine, a move welcomed by Turkey but condemned by Israel. Ceasefire talks have collapsed, 8 ships are being seized in international waters, and pressure is mounting on Netanyahu amid corruption trials and a fragile far-right coalition. Joining me on today's episode to discuss the latest developments are Anews editor Mustafa Kocakanar and political analyst Javed Rana.
How are you? Fine. And you?
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan held a phone call with French President Emmanuel Macron on Sunday to discuss the worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza. The Turkish leader praised his French counterpart's decision to formally recognize the state of Palestine, calling it a courageous step toward justice and regional peace. The Turkish president expressed strong support for France's landmark move, commending Macron for what he described as a vital decision that aligns with the long-standing aspirations of the Palestinian people. He also congratulated France for becoming the first G7 country to recognize Palestinian statehood. Erdoğan told Macron that the conflict between Israel and Palestine must come to an end, emphasizing the importance of international action to ensure a sustainable peace based on a two-state solution. France is set to formally recognize the state of Palestine during the United Nations General Assembly in September. The decision has been welcomed by pro-Palestinian voices worldwide but has drawn sharp criticism from Israel and the United States. Despite the backlash, Macron defended the move as part of France's commitment to reviving the two-state vision and ensuring long-term stability in the region. France's recognition is expected to reshape Western diplomatic engagement with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Turkey has been urging the international community to follow France's example, reiterating that global silence in the face of Gaza's suffering must end.
Welcome back to the program. Anews editor Mustafa Kocakanar, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Omar.
Mustafa, as we were watching in this news report, the Turkish president has congratulated his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron over the decision to recognize the state of Palestine in September at the UN General Assembly. Now, Mustafa, how important is this phone call and Erdoğan talking to Western leaders, because we've witnessed their stance before? How important is this phone call, Mustafa, with other European counterparts at this point when we see the devastation in the occupied Gaza Strip?
Omar, last week, I think France took an important decision in terms of bringing a long-standing peace and stability to the Middle East. French President Emmanuel Macron announced his government's decision to officially recognize the Palestinian statehood. And France is set to recognize the independence of Palestine at the United Nations General Assembly meeting in September. And France is becoming the first G7 country in terms of recognizing the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people living in the Middle East. And within this context, yesterday, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan held a phone conversation with his French counterpart, Emmanuel Macron, to discuss the deteriorating humanitarian situation in the occupied Gaza Strip. On the other hand, President Erdoğan also praised Macron's decision to recognize Palestine. As we know that Turkey has been always calling for a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Turkey thinks that if there is independent Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital, it will help both the Israelis and Palestinians ensure peace and tranquility in the Middle East. Within this context, Turkey has been always calling upon its Western allies within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to recognize the Palestinian statehood. Right now, I think Canada is also preparing preparing to join France to recognize Palestine. It is clearly showing that Turkey's diplomatic actions and initiatives are yielding positive results in terms of solving the decades-old dispute between Israelis and Palestinians. I think that Turkey and France right now are determined to strengthen their cooperation in terms of solving the long-standing disputes in the Middle East. I think that on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly meeting in September, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan maybe will meet with his French counterpart Macron to discuss the latest geopolitical developments in the region. I think that other Western countries will follow France's decision to recognize Palestine. On the other hand, we know that some Western countries, including Spain and Norway, have already recognized the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. I think that the bottom line is that the two-state solution is the best option in terms of solving a dispute between Israelis and Palestinians.
Mustafa, now there have been developments in the occupied Gaza Strip over the last 24 to 48 hours. Israel has announced a 10-hour daily tactical pause. Now, this is not a ceasefire, and it has not promised that it will stop its attacks once these tactical pauses are over. Now, these tactical pauses have been announced in certain areas, not in the entirety of the occupied Gaza Strip. There's Al-Mawasi, there's Deir al-Bala, and then there's Gaza City. So in these areas, from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m., Israel is going to have these tactical pauses and aid is going to be distributed. Now, Jordan and the United Arab Emirates have also started airdropping aid. So, Mustafa, what's the latest that we know about these plans, these new plans by the Israeli government?
Well, we know that right now Palestinian people are being starved to death by the Israeli security forces, because Israeli security forces have been deepening their military operations in the occupied Gaza territory, and international criticism is mounting on Israel over the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. And given the situation on the ground, Israel announced its decision to impose a tactical pause their military offensive in the region. It is clearly showing that international criticism is yielding positive results in terms of halting Israel's military actions in the region. But I think that the words, the criticism, don't feed the Palestinian people waiting for the humanitarian aid packages. I think that right now international solidarity is also working in terms of ensuring peace and tranquility in the Gaza Strip. But I am still struggling to understand the United States foreign policy goals towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. U.S. President Donald Trump is always reaffirming the United States' unwavering support for Israel's military actions and so-called national security demands in the region. On the other hand, Trump yesterday tried to hold the international community accountable for the humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. But on the ground, we know that the United States is doing everything to make Israel continue their military actions in the region. U.S. President Donald Trump several times welcomed Israel's embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to the White House this year. He praised Israel's military actions in the region, but he is still criticizing the international community for the deteriorating humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. I think that we need to see concrete steps from the international community to mitigate the humanitarian tragedy in the Gaza Strip. I think that coercive measures will be needed to convince the Israeli decision makers of halting their military actions in the region. I think that coercive measures can include arms embargo, economic sanctions, and cutting military ties with this country in the Middle East. As you know, Turkey has already halted its trade activities with Israel to bring the Israeli decision makers to the negotiating table to strike a ceasefire or a peace deal with Hamas. I think that unity and solidarity among Western or Eastern countries will yield positive results in terms of upholding the Palestinian rights.
Mustafa, Israel now has also detained 21 activists who were on board an aid ship which was bound for the occupied Gaza Strip. Handala, that was the name of the vessel that was carrying that aid. Now, Israeli forces have detained those activists who were on board. There are 2 Italians, I believe 5 to 6 people are from the United States. They have asked their governments to help them and to speak to the Israeli government to release them because their boat was not even in Israeli territorial waters. Now, Mustafa, what do you expect? What are you expecting from these recent events? Because we saw as well that Madleen a few weeks ago was another boat which was detained by Israel, and then the activists on board were deported. So, what do you make of these latest developments here, Mustafa?
Well, over the weekend, Israel illegally intercepted a Gaza-bound humanitarian aid ship in the international waters, and Israeli security forces detained dozens of humanitarian activities within this Gaza-bound humanitarian ship. The Israeli security forces also confiscated Gaza humanitarian aid cargoes, and it is clearly showing that Israel is still determined to isolate Gaza from the international community. Israel right now is doing everything to kill the Palestinian people living in the Gaza Strip, and we know that since October 7, 2023, Israeli security forces have murdered more than 60,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children, living in the Gaza Strip. And as you know, at the end of May, United States and Israel launched so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was supposed to distribute humanitarian aid packages to the war-weary Palestinians living in the war-torn Gaza Strip. But on the contrary to expectations from the international community, Israeli security forces are still targeting and taking aim at Palestinians waiting for the humanitarian aid packages delivered by the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And right now, I think international pressure is mounting on Israel over the dire humanitarian situation and humanitarian tragedy in the Gaza Strip. It is crystal clear that Israel is conducting war crimes and crimes against humanity in Israel, in Gaza right now, and it is clearly showing that the Western countries are complicit in the war crimes committed by the Israeli security forces in the Gaza Strip, because we know that Western countries, the United States in particular, are still turning a blind eye to humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. Yes, some Western countries, including Germany, France, United Kingdom, they are criticizing Israel's military activities in the region, but on the other hand, they are still supplying weapons and ammunition to Israel. They are still hesitating to call what happens in Gaza as a genocide, and it is clearly showing the Western hypocrisy over the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. As you also know, last month, Israel also intercepted another Gaza-bound humanitarian ship. Israeli security forces detained humanitarian activists. Israeli security forces confiscated another humanitarian cargo materials, and it is clearly showing that Israel, I think, will continue to turn a blind eye to international criticism over the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. And I think that regional countries must be united against Israel if the international community or regional stakeholders want to bring long-standing and sustainable peace and tranquility. I think we have to see some concrete steps from these countries on the ground.
Musa, from 6 to 7 weeks from now, we'll probably be seeing the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Now, what are you expecting from this General Assembly, Mustafa? Because we've seen over the past few years how Muslim leaders have, criticized the Israeli policies in the occupied Gaza Strip and the activities that they've done, the massacre of the Palestinians. Everything has been criticized. Now that there's a European front with France, Norway, Ireland, and Spain, how are you expecting this General Assembly, to proceed? Because now we have a European front as well, which is against the Israelis.
Omar, as you mentioned, the United Nations General Assembly will be held in September in United Nations headquarters in New York, and dozens of world leaders will gather at the United Nations General Assembly meeting to exchange views on the regional and international security challenges. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan will address the United Nations General Assembly to increase the international awareness about Israel's ethnic cleansing policies and genocidal international acts in the Middle East. I think that it will be useful for world leaders to discuss the regional and international security issues. But on the other hand, we know that United Nations is controlled by the UN Security Council members, and there are 5 permanent members within the UNSC, and these countries are the United States, the United Kingdom, China, France, and Russia. And we know that if one of these countries veto any actions regarding international issues, United Nations fail to address these security challenges. That is the reason why Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan is always reiterating at every opportunity that the world is bigger than 5. And Turkey has been always calling for reform within the United Nations Security Council. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is also praising Turkey's diplomatic efforts and initiatives in terms of reforming the United Nations Security Council. On the other hand, some countries, including Brazil and South Africa, they are also trying to join Turkey's efforts to reform United Nations Security Council. But we know that permanent members are still opposing the reform efforts and initiatives for the United Nations Security Council, because they know that if the UN reform itself, they will lose their privileged status within the United Nations Security Council. And I think that this year's United Nations General Assembly meeting, we will witness the reform expectations from the world countries. I think that Turkey will continue to lead the international efforts in terms of reaffirming the United Nations and United Nations Security Council.
Mustafa, thanks for that analysis. We'll be right back with you.
Thank you, Mark.
Gazans scrambled for desperately needed supplies on Sunday as food shortages worsened, with air dropped during a limited Israeli pause in fighting quickly seized by hungry residents.
Aid could be seen being airdropped into parts of Gaza Sunday, as Israel said it would halt military operations for 10 hours a day in areas to help starving Palestinians get fed. This comes as Israel has been facing growing international criticism, which the government rejects, over the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. An indirect ceasefire talks in Doha between Israel and the Palestinian group Hamas have broken off, with no deal in sight. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that while his country would continue to allow the entry of humanitarian supplies into Gaza, that, quote, "We will continue to fight. We will continue to act until we achieve all of our goals, until complete victory." U.S. President Donald Trump, while on a visit to Scotland, said Israel would have to decide its next steps in Gaza.
Israel's going to have to make a decision.
Feris Hassouna, a father of 6, trudged through the dusty streets of northern Gaza on Sunday, carrying a heavy bag of flour on his shoulders. He described to Reuters how food shortages have left his family hungry, and how his children have lost a lot of weight in the process. Aid bags that entered Gaza through Israel was quickly snatched up by residents. In recent weeks, dozens of Gazans have died of malnutrition, according to the Gaza Health Ministry in the Hamas-run enclave. A group of 25 states, including Britain, France, and Canada last week, condemned the drip feeding of aid and said Israel's denial of essential humanitarian aid was unacceptable. On Friday, Israel and the U.S. appeared to abandon ceasefire negotiations with Hamas.
Welcome back. Now let's take a look at the front page of Daily Sabah. Mustafa, like we were talking last week as well, multiple fires have broken out across Turkey, and over the weekend we saw Bursa was one city which was impacted by these wildfires. Now, what's the latest situation? The Turkish government says that investigations are ongoing as to how these fires started. What's the latest that we know, Mustafa?
Omar, right now we are in a summer season, and we are witnessing heat waves across the country, and we know that Turkey has been experiencing wildfires during summer seasons, and right now the country is actively battling widespread forest fires across the multiple regions. Bursa and Karabük in particular, with firefighting teams working tirelessly and relentlessly to contain more than 80 active blazes in challenging terrain and weather conditions. Turkish firefighters are relentlessly trying to extinguish the blazes across the country. On the other hand, Turkish citizens are also helping Turkish firefighters battle blazes, and we know that dozens of Turkish firefighters lost their lives last week while battling the blazes. And on this occasion, I would like to wish Allah's mercy upon the Turkish people, those who lost their lives during the efforts for battling the blazes. I think that the Turkish government will closely monitor the situation, and I think that Turkish government will be continue to be determined to battle the blazes across the country.
Mustafa, also tell me about this initiative for Balkan countries led by the Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, as we can see right there. Tell me more about this initiative.
Turkey has recently initiated the Balkan Peace Platform, and within this context, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan welcomed his counterparts from Balkan countries in Istanbul on Saturday. They discussed all aspects of bilateral or multilateral relationships between Turkey and Balkan countries, and they also exchanged views on the latest situation in the Balkans. And we know that Turkey is one of the most important partners for Balkan countries in terms of ensuring long-standing and sustainable peace and tranquility in the region. On the other hand, we know that Turkish people governed the Balkan region for centuries, and Turkey is more experienced than other Balkan countries in terms of solving regional problems. Within this context, Balkan nations are always praising Turkey's diplomatic efforts and initiatives in terms of bringing political stability and economic prosperity to the region. I think that right now Turkey is determined to strengthen its bilateral or multilateral cooperation with the Balkan countries, because Turkey thinks that if there is something wrong in the Balkans, it will spread the geopolitical chaos to the other parts of the world, and this situation maybe will pose a huge threat to international peace and security. And I think that the collaboration and cooperation among Turkey and Balkan countries will yield positive results in terms of ensuring international peace and security.
Mustafa, thanks for that update on the top stories from Daily Sabah.
You're welcome, Mar.
Now, U.S. President Donald Trump is criticizing the international community for its inaction for the Palestinians. Let's find out more in this news report.
It's terrible. You know, when I see the children, and when I see, especially over the last couple of weeks, and people are stealing the food, they're stealing the money, for the food. They're stealing weapons. They're stealing everything. It's a mess. That whole place is a mess. The Gaza Strip, was given many years ago so that they could have peace. That didn't work out too well. When Israel gave that up, whoever was the prime minister at the time, who I know who it was, but it was not exactly a very clever thing to do, because that was given so that they finally have peace, and it's actually made the situation worse. The U.S. is going to do more aid for Gaza, but we'd like to have other countries participate. We're going to mention that to the European Union today. That's an international problem. It's not a U.S. problem. It's an international problem, and we're giving a lot of money and a lot of food and a lot of everything. When you get it down to a certain number, you're not going to be able to make a deal with Hamas, because once they give them up, then they feel that that's going to be the end of them. And what I said is exactly true. They had a routine discussion the other day, and all of a sudden they hardened up. They don't want to give them back. And so Israel's going to have to make a decision. I know what I do, but I don't think it's appropriate that I say, but Israel's going to have to make a decision.
Welcome back to the program. Joining us now from the Pakistani capital is political analyst Javed Rana. Javed, welcome to the program. I believe we're having a technical difficulty with our guest. Javed,
I can hear you. I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Javed, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Umar. I can hear you.
Javed, I'll start with the ceasefire negotiations that were underway in Qatar. Now, the Hamas delegation says that if the starvation crisis is ongoing in the occupied Gaza Strip, then there's no point in continuing these negotiations. Now, the Israeli side has a unique proposal. Hamas has its own proposal. Why have these negotiations stalled?
I think these negotiations on the behalf of Israel were essentially meant to go for some kind of a ceasefire just for 60 days, which means that there could have been a lease of life for 60 days only for the Palestinians, and then there would be resumption of genocide. That is just a punchline. And without any guarantees to withdraw from Gaza, at least from parts of Gaza, and particularly from the borders between Egypt and Gaza. Now, I think, and then there was also a very false impression, which Israel has been trying to give, that with the ceasefire negotiations, there is a possibility of a ceasefire, and hence there would be resumption of aid to the starving population. Now, I think since these negotiations were going nowhere, and these negotiations were only meant to secure the release of the prisoners of war from the custody of Hamas, and then resume genocidal campaign, I think it looks like that Hamas, this particular decision, is a very strategic, and it is also very tactical. It has both short-term gains, and I hope it will have some kind of also long-term gains. Short-term in the sense that false impression that there would be a ceasefire and there would be resumption of the aid to the Palestinian population. That false impression was again, in a manner, was projected where Israel came under a lot of pressure. And that is why now they had to give some kind of so-called pause in the military operation, allowing some trucks of the food through UN to enter into Gaza. I think that is in terms of something is better than nothing, because the starving population need the food very badly. And more importantly, I think Israel is not abandoning its long-term objectives, which are, everybody knows, basically to expel all these Palestinians from Gaza by creating unlivable conditions, which they have already successfully created. What we are seeing on the ground with the few trucks of aid going into Gaza is just some food for the Palestinian population before they are killed by the airstrikes.
Javed, what's extremely distressing is the fact that Israel has been criticizing the United Nations, saying that they have not been able to deliver the aid that's required, in the occupied Gaza Strip. So what do you make of these statements when the Israeli Foreign Ministry, when the Israeli government, when Israeli cabinet members are criticizing the United Nations and saying that the United Nations should make no excuses while delivering aid? So they haven't allowed the United Nations to deliver aid in the first place.
But that's a sheer stinky propaganda by Israel. Everybody knows. This makes no sense when Israel says that the UN agencies are in league with the Hamas. Does it make sense? This is just an excuse. Then supposedly if that is the case, why the Israeli military have been burning the trucks of foods? Because they don't want population to stay there, create unlivable conditions, to starve them to the death. Now the third leading reason for the death of the Palestinian is starvation. From March 2nd till now, there has been a very little aid. And this so-called Gaza Foundation, I would call it, and many other people call it, Gaza Holocaust Foundation, it has been delivering so-called aid in return of 1,000 people who have been killed. Thousands others have been injured. So again, there is a very obvious method in the madness. And look at what Israeli other far-right ministers have been saying. They are saying it that we don't want the Palestinian population in Gaza. We want to expel them at every cost. So again, their geostrategic religious agenda of Israel's expansion is now in the public domain. They've been propagating it, but then their so-called spokesperson, their foreign ministry, Israeli foreign ministries, they are trying to project a kind of image which doesn't make sense, and only they are ridiculing themselves when they say that this Hamas is stealing this food, when they are saying that the UN agencies are not delivering this food. You talk to the Palestinian people in Gaza and also elsewhere in the Middle East, they will tell you that the UN agencies have turned out to be very effective. They know Palestinian needs. They have already developed mechanism over the period of time where that food delivery is ensured. So I think this essentially Israel has used now many tactics. Propaganda has already been failed. Their Holocaust Foundation turned out to be a death traps, and it has been condemned internationally. And now there looks like Israel is feeling some heat of international pressure. The reason it looks like that, I think within the USA there is no greater debate that why the US congressman, why the US president is being blackmailed. What is it all about in Epstein file? This Jeffrey Epstein, who apparently committed suicide in jail, the man who actually blackmailed the US politicians through underage girls, and everybody knows that the US President Donald Trump, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, he was one of the frequent visitors. And even his last wife, was also Epstein's girl. And that speaks volume what has been happening. Now the debate in the USA is that the Mossad, the Israel's notorious intelligence agency, have blackmailed US politicians, including President Donald Trump, through blackmailing tactics, and Jeffrey Epstein was working for Mossad. And that is why we have seen that despite public commitment, US President now is refusing to make public these Epstein files because it also carries his name.
Javed, a similar reaction we've seen in Europe as well, because in the last few days we saw the statement coming from Emmanuel Macron, the French president, that France will recognize the state of Palestine. But when you look at other countries, for example, Germany and the United Kingdom, they have not explicitly criticized Israel. We've seen Spain do the same. We've seen Norway and Ireland do the same as well. They have recognized the state of Palestine. But do you think that Israel has taken advantage of the Europeans and it has dismantled Europe's foundational values?
I think it has ruined the European values. By the way, I don't believe that the Europeans have universal values. Their values of the freedom of expression, their values of the freedom of association, let's say the Western values, both in case of USA, I think those values are restricted only to their own people. When it comes to the Muslim countries and other third world countries, they have discriminated them. They have been in league with the military dictators over the period of the time, both in case of Turkey in the past, both in case of Pakistan and other third world countries. They have been least bothered about the democracies. So again, what has happened during last 2 years, that Israel, in a very comprehensive manner, basically tarnished the image of the West, that it had some semblance of carrying the human values, because the international order has been destroyed. It is under the rubbles of the demolition sites in Gaza. And I don't think that Europeans have any values left now. International order has been destroyed to the extent that now people talk about China. China is rising even militarily, not just economically. Russia has given tough time to the USA. Russia doesn't listen to the Donald Trump. Why? Because Russia knows that US cannot do it. Russia is not dictating its agenda to the Europe, to the USA. And in a similar fashion, in economic terms, China is dictating its political agenda and economic agenda to the West. Again, in that broader picture, what is the reason? Reason is apartheid Israel, which enjoys complete support from the West, both from Europe, both from the USA. That is a core reason. There has been no international genuine, meaningful reaction against Israel. There were two initial judgments from International Criminal Court, from ICJ. Those were not implemented. Rather, the prosecutors and the judges were sanctioned by the USA. That is the reason that now the international order stands destroyed. All these blocs in the world, they are pursuing their own political agenda, and they are not specifically pursuing the so-called international order in a manner they used to be. US has lost its prestige. US has lost its political influence. US has lost its geostrategic influence. US has lost its economic clout also, partly also because of the, I would call it, stupidities of the President Donald Trump.
Javed, finally, I just want to, touch upon the situation that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is embroiled in. Like you were mentioning, he has ICC arrest warrants. There are public protests at home. His coalition is collapsing as well. And most importantly, he has no idea what to do with the Palestinians. Now, why is he prolonging this war, Javed?
I think it's a long-held view by everybody, by every analyst, that there are domestic reasons. I think that is a micro picture. Domestic reasons are that politically he has been facing tough time, particularly from 2019, when he was indicted on corruption charges, and that now trial has been resumed, and because of internal political dynamics, he's been facing tough time. He could be possibly disqualified. That is a problematic area. Now, again, but the two other extremist, expansionist political parties have withdrawn their support because they want to make it sure that there is no ceasefire agreement on the terms and conditions of Hamas. And at the same time, they have said that they would not support any no-confidence motion against Prime Minister Netanyahu. That means there is a method in the madness. It looks like that there is some kind of a discrete arrangement, political arrangement behind the scene between more extremist terrorist political parties who are coalition partners with the Netanyahu and Netanyahu himself, whereby I think they would prolong this government. This government of Netanyahu is going to last maybe for at least for 3 months, because Israel's parliament is on a vacation for 3 months. So it means there would not be any no confidence motion against the Israel's prime minister. So in that broader context, I don't think that there is any genuine, meaningful opposition to Israel's prime minister at home. Only an isolated group of people who have their loved ones in custody of Hamas, they are concerned. So far as the larger population of Israel is concerned, they have been radicalized, they have been brainwashed over the period of time where they've been told that Arabs are your enemies, Muslims are your enemies, Palestinians are particularly subhuman being, killing them is a justified, even their killing of their babies, their children, their women, their old men, young men, that is a justified. They've been teaching them, citing misleading references of the Holy Bible.
Javed Rana, thank you for that analysis. It was a pleasure having you on the program. Mustafa Kochakanar, thank you so much for being with us in the studio.
Thank you very much.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.